It was the fall of 1989 in the quiet Canadian town of Miramichi, New Brunswick, a place where doors were never locked and neighbors waved to one another across long driveways. It was the kind of town where local law enforcement commented that their arms got worn out from waving back at friendly passersby. People didn't lock their doors. This was a place of safety. That year, the stillness broke. The people of Miramichi found themselves living in fear of a man they could not see, a man who could be anywhere, at any time, and to anyone. They described him as the monster of the Miramichi. He struck without pattern, without mercy. One night, a home would burn. The next, a priest would fall. The community that once thrived on kindness became a town barricaded by its own fear. Gun sales surged, windows were nailed shut, and because of the period, Halloween was canceled. For 7 months, Miramichi became a ghost town. He was the kind of killer who didn't just take lives. He took peace, faith, and sleep from everyone who heard his name. Police said he moved like smoke, vanishing into the woods before dawn. It was like we were chasing a ghost, one officer would later recall. But this ghost had a name, and it is Allan Joseph Legere. Before the country called him a monster, before his face appeared on every front page, Allan Legere was just another child from a forgotten neighborhood, one of 4 children raised in poverty, resentment, and silence. He would one day grow into the man who turned an entire province into a hunting ground. But first, he was a boy watching the world from the shadows of Chatham Head, learning what fear looked like before he ever learned to cause it. They say monsters are born, but in Miramichi, it seemed they were made. Allan Joseph Legere was born in 1948 in Chatham, New Brunswick, a small town along the Miramichi River where winters were long, jobs were scarce, and poverty had a way of sinking into the walls. His mother, Louise, was a single parent trying to raise 4 children in a house that was never warm enough. She rented out rooms to strangers to make ends meet, and one of those men would father Allan before disappearing. There was no father figure, no structure, no safety. He grew up watching his mother bring men home, hearing things no child should ever hear. For a young boy trying to understand his place in the world, that kind of confusion planted something dark within him. Those who knew him as a child remember 2 sides of Allan. Some thought he was bright, creative, and had the potential to be an artist. Others saw a violent, unpredictable boy who fought too often and smiled too little. He liked control, even then. When he felt powerless, he found ways to regain control. He shared a bedroom with his sister and would secretly watch her change clothes. Teachers described him as distracted, angry, and disconnected. He carried that hunger for control everywhere he went. Then came the tragedy that would forever etch itself into his mind. His older brother was struck and killed while crossing a bridge near their home. During her grief, his mother turned on him. "I wish it was you instead," she said. From that moment, Allan Legere carried a kind of wound that never closed. He began to see the world as something that owed him pain. As he grew older, he became known as a thief, a bully, and a small-time criminal who terrified those weaker than him. He was small in stature, but determined to appear strong. He started lifting weights, building muscle, forcing the world to see him as something to be feared. He would walk the streets of Chatham Head bare-chested, his body tense, his eyes cold. People learned not to look at him for too long. Psychologists later said Allan Legere's life became a pattern of humiliation and retaliation. Each act of violence was his way of proving to himself that he wasn't the weak, unwanted child his mother had shamed. He developed an appetite for risk and cruelty. He broke into homes, sometimes while the owners were still asleep inside. He would move their belongings, steal small things, or leave something behind. It wasn't about money. It was about letting people know he had been there. He wanted them to feel what he once felt, powerless. It was in these moments that the boy from Chatham Head disappeared, and the man who would one day terrorize Miramichi began to take shape. By his late 30s, Allan Legere had become a familiar name to police. They saw him as volatile, angry, and dangerous. But no one in the community, not even the officers who had arrested him before, could have imagined what he was truly capable of. What began as petty theft and intimidation was about to evolve into something far darker. And it would start, as many stories of violence do, with a knock on a door. It was the evening of June 21, 1986, when Allan Legere crossed a line he would never return from. In the quiet community of Black River Bridge, New Brunswick, an elderly couple, John and Mary Glendining, ran a small convenience store. They were known for their kindness, the kind of people who kept candy jars on the counter for children and trusted everyone who walked through their door. That night, the trust of a lifetime met its breaking point. After cutting the power to the store, Legere and two young accomplices, Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, broke in. It was supposed to be a quick and simple robbery. But when the Glendinings confronted them, it became something else entirely. Inside that darkened store, the three men unleashed a level of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. John Glendining was beaten so severely that he could not stand. Mary was dragged, beaten, and sexually assaulted. The brutality had no purpose beyond domination. It was as though Allan Legere wanted to erase the very goodness that people like them represented. When it was over, the men fled into the night, leaving John dead on the floor and Mary barely alive, bleeding and broken. She crawled up the stairs toward the telephone and dialed 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line with her until the police arrived. When officers entered the home, they found devastation, but also a witness strong enough to survive. The investigation moved fast. Within days, all three suspects were arrested. Under pressure, Todd Matchett pleaded guilty to murder and assault. Curtis and Legere maintained their innocence, but at trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and the consistency of their stories placed Allan Legere not just at the scene, but at the center of it. He wasn't a bystander. He was the instigator, the leader, the man who decided who lived and who died. Mary Glendining, despite her injuries, testified in court. Her words cut through the silence of the courtroom, describing how her husband's final moments were spent trying to protect her. It was a haunting reminder that courage often exists where cruelty tries to destroy it. When the verdict was read, Allan Legere showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But for Legere, prison was not a sentence. It was a waiting room. Inside, he became what the guards called a model prisoner. He followed rules, kept to himself, and never caused trouble. But behind that quiet mask, he was planning. He studied the habits of the guards, monitored their schedules, and learned how the system functioned. He began to see prison as just another locked house. And like every house he had broken into before, he was determined to find a way out. In May of 1989, he did. By 1989, Allan Legere had been behind bars for 3 years. To the guards, he was quiet, cooperative, and polite. To himself, he was a man rehearsing an act, waiting for the right moment to perform it. He was serving his life sentence at the Atlantic Institution, a maximum security penitentiary in Rennes-Quarryville. But even the highest walls could not contain a man who had made a career out of finding weakness. In the spring of that year, Legere began to complain about a severe ear infection. He played the part of the sick inmate perfectly, calm, polite, patient. Medical staff arranged for him to be transported to the Dumont Regional Hospital in Moncton for treatment. On the morning of May 3rd, 2 correctional officers escorted him in a secured vehicle, handcuffed and shackled. He appeared compliant. What they didn't know was that he had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Hidden inside his body was a sharpened piece of metal, a part of his television antenna that he had broken off, wrapped, and concealed inside himself. He had turned his own body into a weapon and a lockpick. When he arrived at the hospital, he asked to use the washroom. It was a simple request, one that seemed harmless. The officers allowed it. In that small, tiled room, Allan Legere pulled the metal from his hiding place and began to pick at the lock on his handcuffs. Within seconds, they fell away. He freed his legs, steadied his breathing, and prepared for what came next. When the guards opened the door, he lunged. In his hand, the metal rod looked like a knife. The guards, unarmed except for tear gas, were caught off guard. He sprayed them, shoved past, and ran. Legere burst through the hospital corridors, tearing through the front doors, vanishing into the parking lot before anyone could react. The first car he came to belonged to Peggy Olive, an outpatient who had just arrived. He opened the door and shoved her aside. He said he was being held for murder. She would later recall, "He pressed something to my throat and told me to drive." She thought she was about to die, but as quickly as he had taken control, his mood shifted. He spoke calmly, even gently, assuring her she wouldn't be hurt. Then, without warning, he released her. When he let me go, Peggy said, "He told me he wouldn't harm my car either." It was a strange kind of evil, the kind that could speak softly while planning the next act of violence. Legere abandoned the car and disappeared into the city. He had no money, no food, and no plan other than one thought that seemed to guide him: go home. By the time authorities realized what had happened, he was already gone. The largest manhunt in New Brunswick's history began that night. Roadblocks were set up, warnings issued, but it was too late. He was already on his way back to Miramichi, back to the town that had put him behind bars. In the coming months, he would make sure they remembered his name. When Allan Legere escaped, most people assumed he would run far. The Miramichi was the last place anyone thought he'd return to, but they didn't know him. For Legere, this was personal. It was home. By the end of May 1989, whispers began spreading through the town, accompanied by break-ins, strange sounds in the woods, and shadows moving at night. And then came the first fire. On May 29th, the home of 75-year-old Annie Flamm erupted in flames. Neighbors ran to help, but the fire was already consuming the house. Her sister-in-law, Nina Flamm, barely escaped, her body covered in burns. She was taken to the hospital in critical condition, but before she lost consciousness, she managed to speak 5 words that changed everything. "He tied me to the bed." Investigators soon discovered that the fire wasn't an accident. The women had been attacked by an intruder who demanded money, then turned violent when they resisted. Annie had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled before the house was set on fire. The scene was so horrific that even seasoned detectives were shaken. What little evidence survived the blaze told a disturbing story. Nina remembered her attacker wearing a metal chain around his waist, the kind used to restrain prisoners. It was the first real clue that Allan Legere, the escaped convict, was back. Overnight, the Miramichi changed. Doors that had never been locked were bolted shut. People slept with guns beside their beds. Parents kept their children inside. Police set up checkpoints, and officers began patrolling in pairs. But Legere was always one step ahead. He knew the woods, shortcuts, the dirt roads, and the blind spots in the town's layout. He moved silently, as if he had melted into the landscape. And the weeks turned into months. There were sightings, but none confirmed. Then, in October, the nightmare returned. It was the night of October 13, 1989, when fire once again lit up the sky, this time at the home of Linda and Donna Donnie, 2 sisters who shared a residence in Newcastle. When police arrived, they found the house engulfed in flames and the bodies of both women inside. They had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled before the fire was set. The violence was savage, deliberate, and personal. Investigators said it looked like someone had taken their time. Forensic teams recovered DNA traces from the crime scene. It was an emerging science at the time, but what they found would later confirm what everyone had already feared. The genetic profile matched that of Allan Legere. The people of Miramichi began to panic. Rumors spread faster than the investigation could control. Some said they saw him walking along the river at night. Others swore they heard him outside their windows. Stores closed early, the streets emptied by sunset, and gun shops sold out. Police received hundreds of calls from terrified residents. The town had turned into a fortress of fear. Legere was no longer just a fugitive. He was a ghost story that had come to life. Then came the final act. On the night of November 16, 1989, the town's last sense of safety was shattered. The victim this time was Father James Smith, a local priest known for his kindness and devotion. When he failed to appear for a prayer meeting, parishioners went to check on him. What they found was beyond comprehension. Father Smith's body was discovered inside his rectory, brutally beaten and mutilated. His neck was slashed, his chest cut open, his jaw broken. The attack was so violent that investigators described it as torture. To kill a priest in a small Catholic community felt like an attack on faith itself. By now, the Miramichi was paralyzed. People slept in shifts. Some fled town entirely. Even the police admitted they felt like they were chasing a shadow. It was like we were hunting a ghost, one officer said later. Legere taunted them without saying a word. He left behind chaos and silence, mooking through the woods, feeding off the fear he created. He had turned the entire region into his own hunting ground. For 201 days, he had controlled an entire community through terror. And when the fires burned out and the screams went quiet, he simply vanished again. But even monsters grow tired of running, and this one was about to make a mistake. By late November, the Miramichi had been living in fear for over 6 months. 4 people were dead, and the police had no idea where their killer was hiding. Patrol cars crept through back roads, but Allan Legere had vanished. The Crime Stoppers' reward had climbed to $50,000, but despite hundreds of tips, police were no closer to finding him. Then, on the night of 23 November 1989, in St. John, Legere struck again, not to kill, but to run. He hijacked a taxi at gunpoint, forcing the driver, Ron Gonk, to take him toward Moncton through blowing snow and icy roads. When Gonk lost control and crashed into a snowbank, Legere waved down another car, this time driven by Michelle Mercer, an off-duty RCMP constable. With both Gonk and Mercer now hostages, Legere ordered Mercer to continue driving. But in the whiteout, she lost her way and eventually stopped for fuel near Sussex, New Brunswick. There, Mercer and Gonk managed to escape and raise the alarm. Still desperate, Legere hijacked a transport truck next, ordering its driver, Brian Golding, to take him to Moncton. By then, Mercer had reached an emergency telephone, and RCMP roadblocks snapped into place across the province. On the morning of 24 November, officers spotted the truck near Newcastle. Surrounded and out of options, Allan Legere surrendered without a struggle. He was finally back in custody, and the most extensive manhunt in New Brunswick's history was over. Ironically, had Legere served his first sentence quietly, he might have been eligible for parole years ago, but his escape guaranteed he would die behind bars. Word of his capture spread through the Miramichi like sunlight breaking through fog. The streets were filled with so much joy, as though Christmas had come early. After 201 days of fear, they could finally breathe again. He was returned to custody, this time under extreme security. No more hospitals, no more leniency, no more freedom. The man who had terrorized a community for months was once again behind bars. But for many in Miramichi, the relief came with another feeling: disbelief. They had lived with so much fear that even after his capture, they still expected him to return. The nightmare was over, but the wounds he left behind would not heal so easily. After his capture, Allan Legere was taken to Fredericton, where he was held in a downtown jail during his trial. For the first time, the people of Miramichi could look at him and know that he was truly caged. But what awaited him inside the courtroom would become one of the most critical legal milestones in Canadian history. In August 1990, Legere was convicted of charges related to his escape from the Atlantic Institution and sentenced to an additional 9 years. But the real trial, the one that would define his legacy, began that November. It was the first time in Canada that DNA profiling would be used not to exonerate, but to convict. The technology was new, fragile, and largely untested in the courtroom. But in this case, the evidence was undeniable. Scientists compared genetic samples found at the murder scenes, the traces left on burned clothing, under fingernails, and on fragments of wood from the fire sites. Each time, the results pointed to one man. The odds of a mistake were 1 in 9 million. The prosecution described Legere as a predator who had turned Miramichi into a hunting ground. Witnesses painted a portrait of a man who shifted between calm intelligence and uncontrollable violence. Among the witnesses was Nina Flam, the only living victim of his 201-day reign of terror. Scared and frail, she took the stand and told the court what she remembered: the way he tied her down, the smell of smoke, the sound of him leaving the house as the flames began to spread. Her testimony silenced the room. Even hardened reporters struggled to write their notes. Legere sat motionless throughout the trial, expressionless, as if he were listening to someone else's story. When the verdict came, he didn't flinch. On November 3, 1991, the court found Allan Joseph Legere guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Forensic experts would later call the case a turning point for Canadian criminal justice, the moment DNA proved its power not just to free the innocent, but to expose the guilty. After the trial, the old jail that had once held Legere was shut down. Years later, it was converted into a science museum. Inside one of its exhibits, visitors can still see the very cell where Legere was kept during his trial. Behind its glass walls sits an exhibit dedicated to DNA profiling, the science that finally caught the monster of the Miramichi. For the families of his victims, justice had finally been done. But for the people who lived through it, the memories remained. Every fire, every scream, every knock at the door in the dark. In the years that followed, the name Allan Legere became synonymous with fear, a reminder of what one man could do when driven by rage and power. After the trial, Allan Legere was transferred to one of Canada's most secure prisons. For years, he was kept inside the super maximum security unit in Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines, Quebec, a facility built for the most dangerous offenders in the country. There were no chances left to run. No hospital visits, no moments of opportunity. The man who had once haunted the forests of New Brunswick now lived inside concrete walls. He continued to serve his sentence quietly, showing the same false composure that had fooled so many before. He read books, attended programs, and kept to himself. But those who knew his pasts said he was never rehabilitated. He was simply contained. In 2015, the Correctional Service of Canada transferred him to the Edmonton Institution in Alberta, another high-security prison designed for violent offenders. Officials offered no details beyond the standard explanation: inmate relocation for management purposes. But for the people of the Miramichi, it didn't matter where he was, only that he stayed there. Even decades later, his name still provokes unease. In August 2020, after more than 30 years behind bars, Allan Legere applied for day parole. The news spread quickly through New Brunswick, reopening old wounds that had never truly healed. On January 13, 2021, the Parole Board of Canada reviewed his application. After hearing statements from the victims' families and assessing his psychological reports, they denied his request. They concluded that Legere still posed a high risk to public safety and showed little genuine remorse. For the people of Miramichi, it was a decision that reaffirmed what they already knew, that some monsters should never walk free. Today, the town has rebuilt itself for a long time. The doors that were once locked in fear are open again. The rivers still flow, the woods still stand, and children play where silence once ruled. Yet the memory of those 201 days has never faded. When residents speak of that time, their voices are still lower. They remember the smell of smoke in the air, the headlines that changed each morning, the feeling that evil was moving somewhere just beyond the trees. The Legere case permanently changed the way violent crimes are investigated in Canada. It marked the first time DNA evidence was used to secure a conviction, setting a precedent that would shape forensic science for decades to come. Allan Legere will likely die in prison, but the question his story leaves behind still lingers, a question that criminologists, psychologists, and ordinary people continue to ask. Was he born to kill, or did the world around him teach him how? Some believe it was due to circumstances, poverty, shame, or a broken home. Others think it was something darker, something in his nature that no environment could ever have changed. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: 4 innocent lives lost, an entire community scarred, and a name that will forever echo through Canadian criminal history. Allan Joseph Legere, the Monster of the Miramichi. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more true crime documentaries that explore the minds of the world's most dangerous killers. Every week, we uncover the stories that force us to ask the most challenging question of all. Are criminals born, or are they made?